You won't believe what happens when Jake Morgan visits his own dealership in disguise. Imagine this: the scorching summer sun of Los Angeles casting a golden glow over rows of luxury cars parked outside Prime Elite Motors, the crown jewel of Jake Morgan's rapidly expanding empire. This wasn't just any dealership, it was his dealership, acquired just a few weeks ago. But today wasn't a day for suits or grand entrances. No, today was a day to uncover the truth. Jake drove his inconspicuous silver SUV into a back parking spot, its dull paint job paling in comparison to the glossy showroom-ready finishes sparkling under the sun. Clad in a gray hoodie, worn jeans and sneakers that had seen better days, Jake looked like any ordinary customer. His heart raced, not with nerves but with anticipation. Today he would witness firsthand how his employees treated someone they didn't deem worthy of the luxury experience. As he stepped out of his car, Jake took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sleek glass facade of the building. It stood tall and commanding, a symbol of status and aspiration for anyone stepping through its automatic doors. With his hood slightly up and his posture relaxed, Jake was a shadow of his usual commanding self. Today he wasn't the boss, he was just another customer. Through the glass doors, Jake saw a small group of employees gathered near the front desk. Their conversation was light-hearted, peppered with occasional laughter. Jake hesitated for a brief moment before stepping inside. The transition from the blistering heat outside to the cool air-conditioned showroom was stark, like stepping into another world. The faint scent of leather and fresh car wax hung in the air, a hallmark of the high-end vehicles lined neatly on the floor. As Jake moved further in, the chatter gradually faded. Glances flicked his way, subtle but telling. The shift in energy was palpable, like a ripple spreading across still water. These weren't hostile looks, but they carried something unmistakable, quiet judgment wrapped in polite indifference. Jake wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of scrutiny, but it still left a sting. Before he could fully take in the showroom, a sharp voice broke the tension. "Excuse me," it called out. Turning, Jake saw her, a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked authoritatively on the tiled floor. Her name tag read Sandra Miles, sales manager. Clipboard in hand, she approached with a composed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you with something?" Sandra asked, her tone polite but clipped, carrying an undercurrent of skepticism Jake could easily detect. Jake responded casually, almost disarmingly. "Just looking around," he said with a smile, gesturing toward the gleaming lineup of luxury cars. Sandra's eyes scanned his attire, his hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. The pause was brief but revealing. Her voice softened, taking on a tone Jake recognized all too well, reserved for those deemed out of place. "Well, sir, we cater to a very specific clientele," she said, her words carefully chosen but clear in implication. "Many of our vehicles require pre-approval. Perhaps I can suggest something more suitable for you?" Jake's smile remained, but a spark of determination flickered in his eyes. "Are you assuming I don't qualify?" he asked, his tone calm but with an unmistakable weight. The question caught Sandra off guard, her polished composure wavering for just a moment. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly, trying to regain her footing. "I'm just trying to save you some time." The tension in the air thickened as Jake held her gaze, his expression steady but unyielding. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, his voice soft yet deliberate. "But let's see if you're right." Sandra hesitated, unsure of what to say next. Jake didn't push further. Instead, he let the moment linger, knowing he had seen enough. This was shaping up to be a very interesting day, and a turning point for Prime Elite Motors. When the atmosphere shifted and the test began, Jake pushed open the glass doors of Prime Elite Motors and stepped into a completely different world. The icy cool of the air-conditioned showroom was a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The air inside carried a distinct, luxurious scent, a blend of fine leather, fresh car wax, and a subtle hint of sophistication. Bright overhead lights illuminated rows of pristine luxury vehicles, each one gleaming like a polished gem. The moment Jake entered, the light-hearted chatter that had filled the room moments earlier faded. Conversations halted, replaced by a palpable shift in the atmosphere. A handful of employees, scattered near the front desk, exchanged brief, almost imperceptible glances. Their eyes flicked quickly to his hoodie and sneakers, betraying silent judgments they likely thought weren't noticeable. But Jake noticed. He always noticed. He didn't let it faze him, though. This wasn't about proving a point just yet. He was here to observe, to understand the culture he had inherited with the dealership. Every small reaction, every subtle cue was a piece of the puzzle he was putting together. Then from across the gleaming showroom she appeared. Sandra Miles. Middle-aged and impeccably polished, Sandra carried herself with the authority of someone who had long been in charge. Her sharp features were accentuated by the precise cut of her tailored blazer, and her polished heels clicked purposefully against the pristine tiled floor. Tucked under her arm was a clipboard, the universal emblem of managerial control. She wasn't just approaching Jake, she was advancing toward him with purpose. Her expression was polite, professional even, but Jake caught it, the faint tightness in her smile. It wasn't genuine warmth, it was the kind of smile that spoke volumes, a subtle blend of skepticism and condescension. "Excuse me," Sandra began, her voice as crisp and clipped as her stride. "Can I help you with something?" Jake returned her polite tone with a calm, disarming smile. "Just here to look around," he said casually, gesturing toward the impressive lineup of cars. Her sharp gaze flicked over him again, scanning him from his worn sneakers to the hoodie that hung loosely over his shoulders. If she noticed her own lingering hesitation, she didn't show it, but Jake did. She recovered quickly, though, her expression slipping back into one of controlled professionalism. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asked, her tone carrying just enough of an edge to hint at doubt. It wasn't overt, but it was there, subtle, calculated. Jake nodded, maintaining his easygoing demeanor. "Something like that?" Sandra's lips pressed together, her clipboard shifting slightly in her grip. There was no mistaking her judgment, though it was cloaked in a veneer of helpfulness. "Well," she said, her tone dropping to something softer, almost patronizing. "We cater to a very specific clientele here. Many of our vehicles require pre-qualification. Perhaps I can help you find something more appropriate?" Jake's smile didn't waver, but beneath it, his resolve solidified. He didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air just long enough to make her shift slightly on her polished heels. "I see," he finally said, his voice calm but pointed. "And what exactly makes you think I don't qualify?" Her eyes widened ever so slightly, a reaction she quickly masked with a practiced smile. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that," she said smoothly. "I'm just trying to save you time." Jake's gaze remained steady, unyielding as he considered her response. The tension between them was almost tangible, thick enough to slow time itself. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a moment like this, but today, it held more weight. He wasn't just a customer, he was the unseen hand behind every decision, every sale, and every interaction in this building. "Saving me time?" Jake repeated, his tone even, his smile faint. "Well, let's see if you're right about that." Sandra blinked, momentarily unsure of how to respond. Jake didn't press further. Instead, he stepped back slightly, giving her room to continue while silently deciding she'd already shown him more than enough. This was going to be a day she wouldn't soon forget, and neither would Prime Elite Motors. The moment assumptions were made and tested. Jake remained calm, his demeanor relaxed as he gestured casually toward the stunning cars displayed in the showroom. "Just here to look around," he said, his voice as effortless as his posture. Sandra's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, scanning him from head to toe, her polite mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of something less welcoming, doubt. "Are you looking to buy a car today?" she asked, her tone professional but tinged with skepticism, the kind that suggested she had already made up her mind about him. Jake nodded, his smile unwavering. "Something like that," he replied, his voice calm and steady. Sandra's lips pursed tightly, the clipboard in her hand shifting as she adjusted her stance. "Well," she began, her tone carefully measured, "we cater to a very specific clientele here. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification." Her words were polite, but the underlying implication was clear. "Perhaps I could recommend?" Before she could finish, another employee's voice rang out from across the room. "Hey Sandra, the delivery guy is here." For a brief moment, Sandra's attention wavered, her eyes flicking toward the source of the interruption. But as quickly as it shifted, her focus snapped back to Jake, her gaze narrowing as if ensuring he wouldn't wander too far or touch something he shouldn't. Jake raised an eyebrow, amused by the subtle tension in her body language. Keeping his tone light, he asked, "So, you're assuming I'm not qualified?" The question landed like a small shockwave, catching Sandra momentarily off guard. Her composed exterior faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, her posture stiffening as she gripped the clipboard more tightly. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she replied, her smile forced and overly polished. "These vehicles start at 6 figures. Maybe I can direct you to something more," she hesitated, searching for the right word, "accessible." Jake's expression didn't change, his calm composure remained unshaken, but her choice of words wasn't lost on him. Internally he took note of every detail, the subtle judgments, the assumptions, the undercurrent of condescension. It wasn't anger he felt, but he decided to see how far this interaction would go. Sandra's demeanor was telling him more about the dealership's culture than any performance report ever could. Whatever was coming next, Jake was ready to meet it head-on. The subtle dance of assumptions and unspoken word. The sting of her assumptions lingered, undeniable in its sharpness. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the tension thick in the air as Sandra looked at Jake expectantly, waiting for his reaction. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence work in his favor, his eyes wandering around the showroom as if casually admiring the cars on display. His gaze landed on a sleek silver coupe, its aggressive design exuding power and luxury. Jake took a step closer, his fingers brushing lightly against the door handle. He glanced back at Sandra, his voice calm and casual. "Nice car," he said simply, his tone free of the tension she had introduced into the interaction. Sandra's brows furrowed ever so slightly at his remark. She forced another tight smile, the kind that was more about control than friendliness. "It is," she said briskly. "Perhaps, when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment. For now, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Jake stood there for a beat longer, letting her words sink in. He slowly pulled his hand back from the car, nodding once as he slid his hands into his pockets. "All right," he said, his tone even and measured. "Let's hear it. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Sandra blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the directness of his question. Her composed facade cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of impatience underneath. She hesitated but quickly regained her footing. "Well," she began, her tone carrying a hint of condescension carefully masked as politeness, "maybe something a little more budget-friendly. I can give you directions to a dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles." Jake tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Her suggestion hung in the air, its implication loud and clear. He didn't argue or react. Instead, he simply smiled faintly, his calm demeanor refusing to give her the reaction she might have expected. Inside, Jake made another mental note. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a quiet revelation of the culture that had been allowed to fester here. And Sandra, whether she realized it or not, was laying it bare for him to see. This was exactly why he'd come today, to witness the unfiltered reality. And so far it was speaking volumes. The assumptions that changed everything. Sandra's suggestion hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. A dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles, she had said, her tone polished but laced with quiet judgment. Jake smiled faintly in response, but the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd seen enough. "That's quite the assumption," he said softly, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. The statement seemed to land heavier than Sandra had anticipated. For a brief moment her polished demeanor cracked. She faltered, her confidence wavering just enough to be noticeable. Quickly she straightened her shoulders, regaining her composure. "I'll be back with a list of options," she said briskly, her tone clipped as she turned and walked away, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands like a lifeline. Jake watched her go, his expression unreadable, his thoughts carefully guarded. He turned back to the sleek silver coupe, its glossy finish reflecting his image. For a moment, he studied the reflection staring back at him, his mind already weighing the implications of what he'd observed. This was going to be an interesting day. He stepped into the center of the showroom, hands resting casually in his pockets as his gaze wandered over the luxurious lineup of vehicles. Around him, the faint hum of conversation resumed among the staff, their interactions cautious but not oblivious to his presence. He caught the occasional glance cast in his direction, quick and subtle but unmistakable. It was a kind of scrutiny he had long grown used to, the silent judgment, the coded looks. Jake wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but Sandra's dismissive attitude had been hard to ignore. Her words, her tone, her body language, they spoke louder than any sales pitch ever could. This wasn't just an isolated moment, it was a reflection of something deeper, something systemic. And Jake, more than anyone, knew how damaging that could be. Moments later, Sandra returned, clipboard still in hand, her strides brisk and her forced smile tightly in place. The tension in her demeanor was palpable, her usual confidence now slightly rattled. She stopped a few feet away from him, holding the clipboard like a shield, her eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation. Jake turned to face her fully, his calm, steady gaze meeting hers. He could see it now, the cracks in the armor, the subtle unease. And as she prepared to speak, he couldn't help but think that this was exactly why he had come. Not to humiliate but to understand. to see what needed to change. The real work, he knew, was only just beginning. The list of assumptions and a calm but unyielding challenge. Sandra stopped a few feet away from Jake, her annoyance barely concealed. "All right," she said briskly, holding her clipboard a little tighter. "I've compiled a few options that might be more suitable for your situation." Jake tilted his head slightly, a faint curiosity playing on his features. "My situation?" he repeated, his tone calm but probing. Sandra nodded, her voice clipped as she handed him a neatly printed list of pre-owned vehicles. Each entry was detailed, complete with descriptions and price tags that fell far below the dealership's usual luxury offerings. "These are more accessible models, reliable, economical, and, well, practical," she said, choosing her words carefully but not quite hiding the judgment laced within them. Jake took the paper silently, his eyes scanning the list. A used sedan, an older SUV, and a compact hybrid, none of them anywhere near the league of the showroom's gleaming luxury cars. A faint twitch of amusement pulled at the corners of his lips, but he quickly concealed it. Folding the paper neatly, he slipped it into his pocket. "Appreciate the effort," he said evenly, his tone devoid of mockery but deliberate in its neutrality. For a moment, Sandra seemed caught off guard by his composed response, but she quickly recovered, planting her hands on her hips in a stance of authority. Leaning slightly forward, her voice softened as if she were about to confide something. "Listen," she said, her tone almost conspiratorial. "I'm just trying to be realistic with you. Prime Elite Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Jake met her gaze, his expression calm yet unyielding, a quiet intensity radiating from him. "And what exactly makes you think I'm not your target customer?" he asked, his words measured but pointed, cutting through her assumptions with ease. Sandra hesitated, the question hanging in the air like a challenge she hadn't anticipated. For the first time, her polished confidence faltered, if only slightly. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and Jake could see it. The flicker of doubt in her eyes, the unspoken realization that she might have misjudged him. The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of his question settled, and Jake stood steady, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing unease in Sandra's. This wasn't just a conversation about cars, it was about assumptions, perceptions, and the quiet power of challenging them head-on. The assumptions deepen and the challenge escalate. Sandra hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding, her confidence returning like muscle memory. "I've been doing this a long time," she said firmly, her tone carrying the weight of years of experience. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth." Jake raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but curious. "Out of their depth?" he repeated, his voice calm, almost reflective. "Interesting." For a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Sandra's face, but she pushed through it, doubling down. "I'm just being honest," she said, her tone adopting an air of authority. "It's better to be upfront than to have someone leave disappointed." Jake let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Honest, huh? I like honesty," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. He paused, letting the moment linger before adding, "How about this? Let me speak to the owner. Think we can make that happen?" For the first time, Sandra's polished exterior cracked. Her eyebrows shot up, genuine surprise flashing across her face. "The owner?" she echoed, clearly caught off guard. "That's not possible today. The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're a very busy person." "I'm sure they are," Jake said, nodding slightly, his tone as calm and steady as ever. "But maybe you could give them a call. Let them know I'm here. I think they'd want to meet me." Sandra's smile tightened, the strain showing as her patience began to wear thin. "Look, sir," she said, her voice now laced with irritation, "I'm trying to be as polite as possible, but this is getting ridiculous. I have other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying a car, we can schedule a meeting with one of our sales consultants." Her words hung in the air, heavy with dismissal. But Jake didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unyielding as he considered her response. This was more than a simple misunderstanding. This was a lesson in assumptions, and Jake was more than willing to see it through to its conclusion. The moment everything changed. Sandra's tone grew sharper as her patience wore thin. "We can schedule a meeting with one of our sales consultants," she said, her words clipped and deliberate. "Otherwise?" "Otherwise what?" Jake interjected, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge now. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention. The subtle shift in his tone was enough to silence the hum of the showroom around them. Sandra's eyes narrowed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Otherwise," she said, her voice firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her words hung heavily in the air, laden with implication. The tension between them was almost tangible as Jake stood perfectly still, his gaze locked on hers. The entire showroom seemed to hold its breath, every employee within earshot frozen in place, their eyes darting toward the escalating exchange. After a long moment, Jake finally moved, slowly reaching into his pocket. Sandra watched him cautiously, her brow furrowing. "All right," Jake said, his tone even as he scrolled through his contacts. "I'll make the call myself." Sandra blinked, her irritation giving way to confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "Just calling the owner," Jake replied, lifting his phone to his ear. "Shouldn't take long." Sandra's confidence visibly faltered. Her frustration melted into a confused uncertainty as she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Around them, the showroom seemed to come to a standstill. Conversations ceased, and several employees discreetly stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Jake held up a finger as if to say, "Just a moment," before turning slightly away to speak into the phone. His voice was calm but purposeful. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his tone casual but carrying weight. "I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine, just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here?" He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable as he turned back to Sandra. "They'll be here shortly," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. Sandra stared at him, her confidence now replaced with unease. Who did you just call?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the showroom, catching the wide-eyed stares of several employees who were now frozen in place, watching intently. Finally, he met Sandra's gaze again, his faint smile tinged with something almost playful. "Guess we'll find out," he said. The weight of the moment settled heavily over everyone in the room. Sandra's polished facade was now visibly cracking, and the quiet murmurs among the staff betrayed their shared anticipation. Whatever was about to happen next, it was clear this day was no longer business as usual. The calm before the revelation. Jake ended the call with a quiet, composed air, slipping his phone back into his pocket as if the conversation had been nothing out of the ordinary. Turning to Sandra, he offered a simple statement, his tone casual yet brimming with quiet confidence. "They'll be here shortly." Sandra froze, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what had just happened. Who did you just call?" she asked, her voice shaky, her polished demeanor slipping further with each word. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the showroom, his gaze sweeping over the staff who were now unmistakably tuned into the scene. Their hushed whispers and stolen glances betrayed their growing curiosity and unease. Turning back to Sandra, he gave a faint, almost playful smile. "Guess we'll find out," he said, his tone light but carrying an edge that only deepened the tension in the room. The air grew thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Sandra shifted uncomfortably, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. She pretended to busy herself with notes, but her movements were stiff, mechanical, betraying the unease she couldn't hide. Meanwhile, Jake stood by one of the gleaming luxury SUVs, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. The stark contrast between his ease and the growing discomfort around him only heightened the tension. He leaned lightly against the car, the polished surface reflecting his steady composure, as if he had all the time in the world. Across the room, the staff whispered among themselves, their curiosity palpable. More and more employees were now watching the scene unfold, their stolen glances becoming less subtle with every passing second. It was clear that whatever was happening, everyone knew it was something out of the ordinary, something big. The minutes dragged on, yet the room felt frozen in time, every moment stretching endlessly. The faint hum of the showroom's air conditioning was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. All eyes occasionally flicked toward the glass entrance, waiting, wondering, speculating. And then, the sound everyone had been waiting for, the faint click of the main doors opening, broke the tension like a crack of thunder. Every head turned, every breath held, as the next chapter of this unfolding drama began. The reveal that stunned everyone. The sound of the main doors opening shattered the tense silence that had gripped the showroom. All heads turned toward the entrance as a sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked softly against the tiled floor, and his expression was serious yet warm. Without hesitation, his eyes locked onto Jake. "Mr. Morgan," the man said with a wide smile, extending his hand as he approached. "So good to see you." Jake stepped forward, meeting the man's handshake with a firm grip, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Thanks for coming, Vince. Appreciate it. The room collectively stiffened, a ripple of realization washing over the staff. Whispers ceased and the weight of the moment grew even heavier. Sandra's clipboard, once held tightly in her grasp, nearly slipped from her hands. Her eyes darted between Jake and Vince, the dealership's regional director, trying to process what was unfolding in front of her. His friendly demeanor shifting into something sharper, she echoed, more professional. Her voice shaky and uncertain. His tone grew curt, the warmth from his previous words now replaced with a controlled edge. "Elena," he said, addressing her by her first name for the first time that day, "I see you've already met Mr. Morgan." Sandra blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize he's the new owner of this dealership," Vince finished for her, his voice carrying a sharp finality that left no room for further explanation. Sandra's face drained of color as the full weight of his words sank in. Her gaze flicked to Jake, whose calm composure hadn't wavered once. The entire showroom seemed to hold its collective breath, the staff's whispers now replaced by a stunned silence. Vince glanced at Jake, an apologetic expression crossing his face. "I trust this wasn't your ideal welcome," he said. Jake raised a hand, his tone measured but firm. "It's all right, Vince. I think Sandra and I just got off on the wrong foot." His words carried weight, and though they were calm, the underlying message was clear. Sandra's eyes widened, her discomfort now impossible to hide as she took an involuntary step back. The dynamic in the room had shifted entirely, and for the first time, the true gravity of the situation became unmistakable. Jake turned his attention back to Vince. "Let's gather everyone. I think we need to have a little chat about how things are run around here." Sandra's composure was crumbling, and the room braced itself for the conversation that was about to change everything. A question that cut to the core. Vince glanced at Jake, an apologetic expression etched across his face. "I trust this wasn't your ideal welcome," he said, his voice low, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Jake raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. "It's all right, Vince," he said calmly, his words measured but carrying undeniable weight. "I think Sandra and I just got off on the wrong foot." His tone was steady, almost disarming, yet the gravity of his words made everyone in the room freeze. Every employee in the showroom seemed to hold their breath, their attention locked on the scene unfolding before them. Sandra's face turned ashen, her usual poise unraveling rapidly. She took an involuntary step back, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield against the growing storm. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Jake's calm gaze didn't waver. "You didn't know what?" he asked gently but firmly, the quiet authority in his tone drawing everyone in. Sandra's lips quivered as she struggled to find the words. That you could own a place like this. That someone like you might actually belong here." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. The showroom, once bustling with whispered speculation, fell silent. Sandra's wide eyes betrayed her regret, but for a moment she seemed utterly lost, grasping for an explanation that wouldn't come. "I didn't mean," she began, her voice faltering. Jake raised his hand again, cutting her off gently but decisively. "It's fine, Sandra." "Really?" he said, his tone softening just enough to ease the sting. Then he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that made everyone unconsciously lean in, hanging on to his every word. "But let me ask you something," he continued, his gaze steady and unwavering. "If I hadn't been the owner, would you have treated me any differently? Would you have given me the same respect you'd give someone who walked in here wearing a suit and tie?" Sandra's lips parted, but no sound came out. The question struck like a bolt of lightning, cutting through every layer of pretense in the room. Her silence was deafening, a confession in itself. Jake let the moment stretch, his calm presence filling the void left by her lack of an answer. Everyone in the room felt the weight of his words, not just Sandra. It wasn't just a question for her, it was a challenge to the entire culture of the dealership, a quiet but profound call to action. And though Sandra couldn't find the words to respond, the lesson was already taking root. The conference room awakening. The silence in the showroom was absolute, heavy with unspoken realizations. Jake nodded slowly as though Sandra's silence had said more than any words could. It was an answer in itself. Turning to Vince, Jake's voice shifted, carrying a new authority that left no room for ambiguity. "Vince, gather everyone in the conference room," he said firmly. "I think it's time we had a little chat about how things are run around here." The staff moved quickly, filing into the sleek conference room at the far end of the dealership. Normally, the room was a symbol of professionalism and success, its glass walls and modern furnishings designed to impress high-end clients. But today the air inside felt thick and stifling. Tension hung like a storm cloud, and every step into the room seemed heavier than the last. Sandra sat near the back, her usual confident posture replaced with a nervous stillness. She gripped her clipboard tightly, her gaze fixed downward as though avoiding the weight of the moment. Around her, employees settled into their seats, their whispers quieting into a hush as they exchanged uncertain glances. Jake stood at the head of the table, calm and collected. His presence commanded attention, his composed demeanor somehow amplifying the gravity of the situation. Vince leaned against the doorframe at the back of the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watched the team take their seats. The last murmurs of conversation faded as Jake cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Thank you all for joining me on such short notice," he began, his tone measured but firm. "For those of you who don't know, my name is Jake Morgan, and I'm the new owner of Prime Elite Motors." The announcement landed like a thunderclap. A ripple of surprise spread through the room, with several employees visibly reacting. Wide eyes, dropped jaws, nervous glances exchanged. Sandra, seated at the back, visibly stiffened, her grip on her clipboard tightening even further. Jake let the murmurs subside before continuing, his voice steady and deliberate. "I came here today dressed casually for a reason," he said, his words carrying an unmistakable weight. "I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to experience firsthand how a potential customer might feel walking through those doors." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room. The weight of his presence, combined with the truth of his statement, was enough to make the entire group hang on his every word. Jake's calm authority was undeniable, and everyone could feel that this was more than a meeting, it was a reckoning. A lesson in perception and culture. The room was thick with a mix of emotions: curiosity, unease, and unmistakable embarrassment. Some employees glanced nervously at Jake, while others avoided his gaze entirely. In the back, Sandra sank lower into her chair, her eyes fixed on her clipboard as if it could shield her from the weight of the moment. Jake stood firm, his voice steady and calm as he addressed the room. "I came here today dressed casually for a reason," he said, his tone deliberate. "I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to experience firsthand how a potential customer might feel walking through those doors." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his gaze sweeping across the group. The silence in the room was deafening, everyone hanging on to his every word. "What I experienced today was disappointing," Jake continued, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "I was judged, not for what I could bring to the table, but for how I looked." His words landed heavily, and Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face visibly flushed. Jake's eyes flicked briefly to her, but he didn't linger. Instead, he turned his attention back to the group as a whole, making it clear this wasn't about singling out one person, it was about addressing something much bigger. "I'm not here to call out anyone individually," Jake said, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. "But we need to have a serious conversation about what this says about the culture of this dealership." Sandra fidgeted in her chair, her discomfort palpable, but Jake didn't let the moment linger too long. He shifted his focus outward, ensuring everyone in the room felt included in what he was saying. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about every person who walks through those doors. Every customer who doesn't fit into someone's preconceived notion of what a luxury car buyer looks like." A quiet murmur spread through the room, but it quickly died down. The weight of Jake's words was undeniable, and no one dared interrupt. Finally, one of the younger sales associates, Chris, hesitantly raised his hand. Jake nodded in his direction, encouraging him with a slight smile. "Go ahead," he said, his tone inviting. Chris swallowed nervously before speaking. "Mr. Morgan," he began, his voice tentative, "I think most of us try to treat customers fairly, but sometimes it's hard not to make assumptions." Jake nodded thoughtfully, his expression both understanding and firm. He had expected this kind of response, but it was exactly the opening he needed to drive home his point. What came next would shape the culture of the dealership, and the people within it, for years to come. Confronting bias and building a better culture. Chris hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice nervous but earnest. "Mr. Morgan," he began, fidgeting slightly, "I think most of us try to treat customers fairly, but, well, sometimes it's hard not to make assumptions." Jake nodded slowly, his thoughtful expression putting Chris at ease. "I get that," he said, his tone understanding yet resolute. "We all have biases whether we want to admit it or not. But here's the thing, it's not enough to just try to be fair. We have to actively challenge those biases." his gaze swept across the room, his words carrying a quiet power. We have to create an environment where everyone feels respected, regardless of their appearance, background, or anything else. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle over the group. The silence was heavy but contemplative, each person seemingly reflecting on their own actions and attitudes. This dealership has built a reputation for excellence, Jake continued, his voice steady and deliberate. But excellence isn't just about the cars we sell. It's about the experience we provide. And from now on, that experience is going to be built on respect, inclusivity, and fairness. A ripple of agreement moved through the room, soft but genuine. Heads nodded and a few murmured their assent. Not everyone looked entirely convinced. Some faces remained wary, uncertain about the changes Jake was suggesting. But the shift in the room was undeniable. A new standard was being set. Jake's gaze finally settled on Sandra, who sat frozen in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous stillness. Jake's voice softened slightly as he addressed her, but his tone remained firm. "Sandra," he said, his eyes steady but not unkind, "I want to give you the opportunity to speak. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Every eye in the room turned toward her. The tension was palpable, the weight of expectation bearing down on her as she struggled to find her voice. Her silence stretched uncomfortably, but Jake didn't rush her. This was her moment and everyone knew it was a pivotal one, not just for her but for the culture of the entire dealership. A moment of accountability and a new direction. Sandra hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I misjudged you and for that I'm truly sorry." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable, his steady gaze locked on her. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I hope this experience serves as a reminder for all of us, not just you, that change starts with accountability." He turned back to the group, his voice carrying a renewed sense of authority and purpose. "Moving forward, we'll be implementing new training programs to ensure this dealership represents the values I believe in. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity. No exceptions." The room was silent, the weight of Jake's words pressing down on everyone present. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Jake let the silence stretch, giving the moment the gravity it deserved. No one dared to speak and the tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Jake broke the silence, his tone calm but resolute. "Good," he said simply, his words carrying a sense of finality. "I'm glad to see we're all on the same page. Change isn't always easy but it's necessary. And this dealership is going to lead by example." The staff nodded in quiet agreement, the initial discomfort in the room slowly giving way to a sense of purpose. Jake's unwavering presence had set the tone for what was to come, a culture built on respect, fairness, and inclusivity. As the weight of the moment began to lift, Jake's steady leadership became a beacon of hope for what Prime Elite Motors could truly become. The path forward wouldn't be easy but for the first time it felt possible, and it started here in this room with this conversation. A moment of accountability and a new direction. Sandra hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I misjudged you and for that I'm truly sorry." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable, his steady gaze locked on her. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I hope this experience serves as a reminder for all of us, not just you, that change starts with accountability." Turning back to the group, Jake spoke with renewed authority. "Moving forward, we're implementing new training programs to ensure this dealership reflects the values I stand for. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions." The room fell silent, the weight of Jake's words pressing down on everyone. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, amplifying the gravity of the moment. Jake let the silence stretch, giving it the space to resonate. No one spoke, the significance of the moment was clear. Finally, Jake broke the quiet, his tone resolute. "Good," he said, his words simple yet profound. "I'm glad to see we're all on the same page. Change isn't always easy but it's necessary. And this dealership is going to lead by example." Around the room, hesitant nods turned into firm agreement. The initial discomfort that had gripped the staff began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of commitment. Jake's presence wasn't just a reminder of what they'd done wrong, it was an inspiration for what they could do right. As the meeting concluded, the team left the room with a shared understanding. Prime Elite Motors was no longer just about selling cars. It was about creating a space where respect, fairness, and inclusivity thrived. Jake had set the tone, and now it was up to them to carry it forward. A renewed purpose and a commitment to change. Jake's voice carried a steady conviction as he concluded, "This dealership will embody a new standard of excellence." This time, the murmur of agreement was louder and more genuine. "I'm here to support you every step of the way." The initial tension that had gripped the room began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of renewed purpose. Employees exchanged nods and murmurs of understanding, their unease giving way to determination. Even Vince, who had been standing silently by the door, nodded in quiet approval, his respect for Jake evident. Jake allowed a faint smile to cross his face, a smile that carried both relief and determination. "All right then," he said, his tone lighter but still firm. "Let's get back to work. And remember, how we treat people matters more than anything we sell." As the employees began to file out of the conference room, Jake caught sight of Sandra lingering near the door. She hesitated before approaching, her hands twisting nervously as she searched for the right words. Finally she spoke, her voice low and sincere. "Mr. Morgan," she began, I want to thank you for giving me a chance to do better. I won't let you down." Jake studied her for a moment, his expression steady but thoughtful. "I hope you mean that, Sandra," he said, his tone measured but encouraging. "Actions speak louder than words. But I believe people can change if they're willing to try." She nodded, her eyes earnest. "I am," she said, the conviction in her voice unmistakable. Jake watched as she turned and left, her posture more determined than when she had entered the room. He turned to Vince, his demeanor shifting back to business. "Let's set up a meeting with the team next week," he said. "I want to make sure everyone knows what's expected moving forward." Vince nodded, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got it, Jake." As Jake stepped back into the dealership floor, he glanced around at the cars, their glossy surfaces reflecting the afternoon light. It wasn't just about running a business anymore, it was about setting a new standard, creating a culture of respect, and proving that change was not only possible but necessary. And with every step forward, Jake felt a quiet optimism that they were heading in the right direction. A shift toward something bigger. As the staff filed out of the conference room, Jake turned to Vince. "Let's set up a meeting with the team next week," he said firmly. "I want to make sure everyone knows what's expected moving forward." Vince grinned, his respect for Jake shining through. "You've got it, boss," he replied. Jake stepped back into the showroom, his eyes drifting over the gleaming cars, their polished surfaces catching the afternoon sunlight. He paused, reflecting on the day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. It wasn't just about running a dealership anymore, this was about creating something bigger. It was about fostering a culture where people were judged by their character, not their appearance. For the first time that day, Jake felt a surge of optimism. Change was never easy, but it was possible, and he was ready to lead the way. Later that week, Jake noticed Sandra interacting with a young customer, a local artist dressed in casual attire, much like Jake had been on that pivotal day. Sandra's approach was warm and genuine, her posture open and attentive. She listened intently, her demeanor reflecting genuine respect and interest. It was a small but significant moment, signaling the beginning of the cultural shift Jake had envisioned. Watching from a distance, Jake felt a flicker of hope grow stronger. It wasn't just about what he had said in the conference room, it was about the changes beginning to take root, however small. This single interaction was proof that a more inclusive and respectful culture at Prime Elite Motors wasn't just a lofty goal. It was possible. And with that, Jake knew the journey toward something greater had truly begun. Disclaimer. We advocate for a world where everyone is treated with equal rights under the law, fostering a society that continues to grow in fairness, development, and civilization. Our goal is to share heartwarming stories that inspire and contribute to making life better. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These stories are not meant to reference any actual people, events, or entities, and they contain no political or religious connotations. Personal reflection and life connection. The story of Jake Morgan is not just a lesson in corporate culture but a powerful reminder of how we perceive and judge others in life. Perhaps, at some point, we've all unconsciously or intentionally allowed biases to shape our actions. But as Jake demonstrated, change is entirely possible, as long as we're willing to face the truth and commit to making things right. The image of Jake, dressed simply in a hoodie, walking into his own dealership, serves as a profound metaphor for breaking stereotypes. It makes me wonder, In our daily lives, do we judge people solely based on appearances? A person dressed modestly doesn't necessarily lack capability. A quiet person isn't necessarily lacking intellect. Too often, we hastily label others without truly understanding who they are. What moved me most was how Jake handled the situation, not with anger or retaliation but with compassion and a determination to foster change. Instead of criticizing, he led by example, igniting a sense of accountability and a desire for growth in his employees. This is the kind of leadership the world needs more than ever. A leader who not only manages tasks but also inspires others to become the best versions of themselves. This story reminds me that cultural change, whether on a small or large scale, begins with how we choose to see and treat one another. Respect and fairness are not luxuries. They are the foundation of any relationship, whether in the workplace or in life. Jake's journey shows that creating a more inclusive and respectful environment is not just a goal but a necessity, and one worth striving for every single day. Never rush to judge others based on their appearance because you can never truly know who they are. Show respect to everyone and your life will become so much more fulfilling. Treat everyone with the purest intentions from your heart. I hope the message from this story helps you create better and more beautiful life experiences. Oh, and don't forget to share your feelings about the story in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to the Soul Deep Stories channel for more heartwarming stories every day. I love you all.